heavily dependent on the more experienced NCOs to provide the necessary leadership. The same problems that afflicted the Federal Army also affected the Biafran Army even more, whose officer corps was based around former Federal Igbo officers. The shortage of experienced officers was a major problem for the Biafran Army, made worse by a climate of paranoia and suspicion within Biafra, as Ojukwu believed that other former Federal officers were plotting against him. Shortly after extending its blockade to include oil, the Nigerian government launched a police action to retake the secessionist territory. The war began in the early hours of the 6th of July 1967, when Nigerian federal troops advanced in 2 columns into Biafra. The Biafra strategy had succeeded. The federal government had started the war, and the East was defending itself. The Nigerian army offensive was through the north of Biafra, led by Colonel Muhammad Shua, and the local military units were formed as the 1st Infantry Division. The division was led mostly by northern officers. After facing unexpectedly fierce resistance and high casualties, the western Nigerian column advanced on the town of Nsukka, which fell on the 14th of July, while the eastern column made for Garkum, which was captured on the 12th of July. Biafran offensive. The Biafrans responded with an offensive of their own. On the 9th of August, Biafran forces crossed their western border and the Niger River into the mid-western state of Nigeria. Passing through the state capital of Benin City, the Biafrans advanced west until the 21st of August, when they were stopped at Ore in present-day Ondo State, 210 kilometers, 130 miles, east of the Nigerian capital of Lagos. The Biafran attack was led by Lieutenant Colonel Banjo, Yoruba man, with the Biafran rank of brigadier. The attack met little resistance, and the Midwestern state was easily taken over. This was due to the pre-secession arrangement that all soldiers should return to their regions to stop the spate of killings, in which Igbo soldiers had been major victims. The Nigerian soldiers who were supposed to defend the Midwestern state were mostly Igbo from that state, and while some were in touch with their Biafran counterparts, others resisted the invasion. General Gowon responded by asking Colonel Murtala Muhammad, who later became head of state in 1975, to form another division, the 2nd Infantry Division, to expel the Biafrans from the Midwestern state, to defend the border of the western state, and to attack Biafra. At the same time, Gowon declared total war and announced the federal government would mobilize the entire population of Nigeria for the war effort. From the summer of 1967 to the spring of 1969, the Federal Army grew from a force of 7,000 to a force of 200,000 men organized in 3 divisions. Biafra began the war with only 230 soldiers at Enugu, which grew to 2 battalions by August 1967, which soon were expanded into 2 brigades, the 51st and 52nd, which became the core of the Biafran Army. By 1969, the Biafrans were to field 90,000 soldiers formed into 5 undermanned divisions together with a number of independent units. As Nigerian forces retook the Midwestern state, the Biafran military administrator declared it to be the Republic of Benin on the 19th of September, though it ceased to exist the next day. The present country of Benin, west of Nigeria, was still named Dahomey at that time. Although Benin City was retaken by the Nigerians on the 22nd of September, the Biafrans succeeded in their primary objective by tying down as many Nigerian federal troops as they could. General Gowon also launched an offensive into Biafra south from the Niger Delta to the riverine area, using the bulk of the Lagos Garrison Command under Colonel Benjamin Adekunle, called the Black Scorpion, to form the 3rd Infantry Division, which was later renamed as the 3rd Marine Commando. As the war continued, the Nigerian army recruited amongst a wider area, including the Yoruba, Itsekiri, Urhobo, Edo, Ijaw, etc. Nigerian offensive. The command was divided into 2 brigades with 3 battalions each. The 1st Brigade advanced on the axis of the Ogugu, Ogunga Nsukka Road, while the 2nd Brigade advanced on the axis of the Gakem Obudu Ogoja Road. By the 10th of July, 1967, the 1st Brigade had conquered all its assigned territories. By 12 July 2nd, Brigade had captured Gakem, Ogudu, and Ogoja. To assist Nigeria, Egypt sent 6 Ilyushin Il-28 bombers flown by Egyptian air crews. The habit of the Egyptians to bomb Red Cross hospitals together with schools, hospitals, and marketplaces did much to earn Biafra international sympathy. Lynn Garrison in cockpit of his F-4 U-7 Corsair 1966. Enugu became the hub of secession and rebellion, and the Nigerian government believed that once Enugu was captured, the drive for secession would end. The plans to conquer Enugu began on the 12th of September 1967. Citation needed. On the 4th of October, the Nigerian 1st Division captured Enugu. Ojukwu was asleep in the Biafran State House when the federal troops attacked and narrowly escaped by disguising himself as a servant. Many Nigerians hoped that Enugu's capture would convince the Igbo's traditional elite to end their support for secession, even if Ojukwu did not follow them. This did not occur. Ojukwu relocated his government without difficulty to Umuahia, a city positioned deep within traditional Igbo territory. The fall of Enugu contributed to a brief destabilization of Biafran propaganda efforts, as the forced relocation of personnel left the Ministry of Information disorganized, and the federal forces' success undermined previous Biafran assertions that the Nigerian state could not withstand a protracted war. On the 23rd of October, the Biafran official radio declared in a broadcast that Ojukwu promised to continue resisting the federal government and that he attributed the loss of Enugu to subversive actions. Nigerian soldiers under Murtala Muhammad carried out a mass killing of 700 civilians when they captured Asaba on the River Niger. The Nigerians were repulsed 3 times as they attempted to cross the River Niger during October, resulting in the loss of thousands of troops, dozens of tanks, and equipment. The first attempt by the 2nd Infantry Division on the 12th of October to cross the Niger from the town of Asaba to the Biafran city of Onitsha cost the Nigerian Federal Army over 5,000 soldiers killed, wounded, captured, or missing. Operation Tiger Claw, 17 to 20th of October 1967, was a military conflict between Nigerian and Biafran military forces. On the 17th of October 1967, Nigerians invaded Calabar, led by the Black Scorpion, Benjamin Adekunle, while the Biafrans were led by Colonel Ogbu Ogi, who was responsible for controlling the area between Calabar and Opobo, and Lynn Garrison, a foreign mercenary. The Biafrans came under immediate fire from the water and the air. For the next 2 days, Biafran stations and military supplies were bombarded by the Nigerian Air Force. That same day, Lynn Garrison reached Calabar, but came under immediate fire by federal troops. By the 20th of October, Garrison's forces withdrew from the battle, while Colonel Ogi officially surrendered to General Adekunle. On the 19th of May 1968, Port Harcourt was captured. With the capture of Enugu, Bonny, Calabar, and Port Harcourt, the outside world was left in no doubt of federal supremacy in the war. Biafran propaganda always blamed military defeats on saboteurs within the ranks of the Biafran officer, and both officers and the other ranks were encouraged to denounce suspected saboteurs. Throughout the war, Biafran officers were far more likely to be executed by their own side than by the Federal Army, as Ojukwu conducted purges and had officers who were merely accused of being saboteurs taken out and shot. Ojukwu did not trust the majority of the former federal Igbo officers who had rallied to Biafra and saw them as potential rivals, thus leading to murderous purges that led to most of them being executed. Furthermore, Ojukwu needed scapegoats for Biafra's defeats, and death was the usual punishment for Biafran officers who lost a battle. Out of a fear of a coup, Ojukwu created several units such as the S Brigade commanded by himself and the 4th Commando Brigade commanded by the German mercenary Rolf Steiner that existed outside of the regular chain of command. Barua wrote that Ojukwu's leadership, especially his frequent executions of his own officers, had a disastrous impact on the morale of the Biafran officer corps. The executions of officers also made it difficult for the Biafran officers to acquire the necessary experience to conduct military operations successfully, as Barua noted the Biafran army lacked both the continuity and cohesion to learn from the war. Control over oil production. Control over petroleum in the Niger Delta was a paramount military objective during the war. Oil exploration in Nigeria was pioneered by the Shell BP Petroleum Development Company in 1937. In a bid to control the oil in the eastern region, the federal government placed a shipping embargo on the territory. This embargo did not include oil tankers. The leadership of Biafra wrote to Shell BP demanding royalties for the oil that was being explored in their region. After much deliberation, Shell BP decided to pay Biafra the sum of £250,000. The news of this payment reached the federal government, which immediately extended the shipping embargo to oil tankers. The Nigerian government also made it clear to Shell BP that it expected the company to pay all outstanding oil royalties immediately. With the stalling on the payment for Biafra, the government instructed Shell BP to stop operations in Biafra and took over from the company. Towards the end of July 1967, Nigerian federal troops and Marines captured Bonny Island in the Niger Delta, thereby taking control of vital Shell BP facilities. Operations began again in May 1968, when Nigeria captured Port Harcourt. Its facilities had been damaged and needed repair. Oil production and export continued, but at a lower level. The completion in 1969 of a new terminal at Forsados brought production up from 142,000 barrels a day in 1958 to 540,000 barrels a day in 1969. In 1970, this figure doubled to 1.08 million barrels a day. The royalties enabled Nigeria to buy more weapons, hire mercenaries, etc. Biafra proved unable to compete on this economic level. International involvement. United Kingdom. The United Kingdom had planned to maintain and expand its supply of cheap, high-quality oil from Nigeria. Therefore, it placed a high priority on maintenance of oil extraction and refining operations. The war broke out just a week before the Six-Day War in the Middle East, forcing oil tankers from the Middle East to use the long route around the Cape of Good Hope, thereby increasing the cost of Middle Eastern oil. In turn, this increased the importance of Nigerian oil to the United Kingdom, because Nigerian oil was cheaper than Persian Gulf oil. Initially, when it was unclear which side would prevail, the United Kingdom took a wait-and-see approach before opting decisively for Nigeria. Nigeria had a navy of only 6 vessels, the largest of which was a frigate, an air force of 76 planes, none of which were fighters or bombers, and an army of 7,000 men with no tanks and a shortage of officers with command experience. Though Biafra was similarly weak, the two sides appeared evenly matched at the beginning of the war, and Nigerian victory was by no means considered preordained. The United Kingdom backed the federal government, but when the war broke out, cautioned them not to damage British oil installations in the east. These oil works, under the control of the Shell BP Petroleum Development Company, jointly owned by Shell and British Petroleum, controlled 84% of Nigeria's 580,000 barrels per day. Two-thirds of this oil came from the eastern region, and another third from the newly created Midwest region. 2/5 of all Nigerian oil ended up in the United Kingdom. In 1967, 30% of the oil being imported into the United Kingdom came from Nigeria. Shell BP therefore considered carefully a request by the federal government that it refuse to pay the royalties demanded by Biafra. Its lawyers advised that payment to Biafra would be appropriate if this government did in fact maintain law and order in the region in question. The British government advised that paying Biafra could undermine the goodwill of the federal government. Shell BP made the payment, and the government established a blockade on oil exports. Forced to choose a side, Shell BP and the British government threw in their lot with the federal government in Lagos, apparently calculating that this side would be more likely to win the war. As the British High Commissioner in Lagos wrote to the Secretary of State for Commonwealth Affairs on the 27th of July 1967, Ojukwu, even victorious, will not be in a strong position. He will require all the international help and recognition he can get. The federal government would be much better placed both internationally and internally. They would have a cast iron case for the severest treatment of a company which has subsidized a rebel, and I feel fairly convinced they would press their case to the lengths of cancelling the company's concessions and nationalizing their installations. I conclude, therefore, if the company does change its mind and asks the British government for advice, the best that could be given is for it to clamber hastily back on the Lagos side of the fence with a checkbook at the ready. Shell BP took this advice. It continued to quietly support Nigeria through the rest of the war, in one case advancing a royalty of £5.5 million to fund the purchase of more British weapons. It was not until federal forces captured the Ocean Oil Terminal at Bonny on the 25th of July 1967 that the British Prime Minister Harold Wilson decided to back Nigeria with military aid. After the federal victory at Bonny, Wilson summoned David Hunt, the British High Commissioner to Nigeria, for a meeting at 10 Downing Street in early August 1967 for his assessment of the situation. Hunt's view that the federal forces were better organized and would win because they could draw upon a greater population led Wilson to side with Nigeria. During the war, the United Kingdom covertly supplied Nigeria with weapons and military intelligence, and may have also helped it to hire mercenaries. After the decision was made to back Nigeria, the BBC oriented its reporting to favour this side. Supplies provided to the federal military government included 2 vessels and 60 vehicles. In the United Kingdom, the humanitarian campaign around Biafra began on the 12th of June 1968, with media coverage on ITV and in The Sun. The charities Oxfam and Save the Children Fund were soon deployed, with large sums of money at their disposal. France provided weapons, mercenary fighters, and other assistance to Biafra and promoted its cause internationally, describing the situation as a genocide. President Charles de Gaulle referred to Biafra's just and noble cause. However, France did not recognize Biafra diplomatically. Through Pierre Loret, France had apparently provided 2 B-26S, Alouette helicopters, and pilots. France supplied Biafra with captured German and Italian weapons from World War II, sans serial numbers, delivered as part of regular shipments to Ivory Coast. France also sold Panhard armoured vehicles to the Nigerian federal government. French involvement in the war can be viewed in the context of its geopolitical strategy, France-Afrique, and competition with the British in West Africa. Nigeria represented a base of British influence in the predominantly French-aligned area. France and Portugal used nearby countries in their sphere of influence, especially Ivory Coast under President Félix Houphouët-Boigny, as way stations for shipments to Biafra. To some extent also, France repeated its earlier policy from the Congo crisis, when it supported the secession of the southern mining province Katanga. Economically, France gained incentives through oil drilling contracts for the Société Anonyme Française de Recherche et d'Exploitation de Pétrolière, SAFRAP, apparently arranged with eastern Nigeria in advance of its secession from the Nigerian Federation. SAFRAP laid claim to 7% of the Nigerian petroleum supply. In the assessment of a CIA analyst in 1970, France's support was actually given to a handful of Biafran bourgeoisie in return for the oil. Biafra, for its part, openly appreciated its relationship with France. Ojukwu suggested on the 10th of August 1967 that Biafra introduce compulsory French classes in secondary, technical and teacher training schools in order to benefit from the rich culture of the French-speaking world. France led the way, internationally, for political support of Biafra. Portugal also sent weapons. These transactions were arranged through the Biafran Historical Research Centre in Paris. French-aligned Gabon and Ivory Coast recognized Biafra in May 1968. On the 8th of May 1968, de Gaulle personally contributed 30,000 francs to medicine purchases for the French Red Cross mission. Fairly widespread student worker unrest diverted the government's attention only temporarily. The government declared an arms embargo, but maintained arms shipments to Biafra under cover of humanitarian aid. In July, the government redoubled its efforts to involve the public in a humanitarian approach to the conflict. Images of starving children and accusations of genocide filled French newspapers and television programs. Amidst this press blitz, on the 31st of July 1968, de Gaulle made an official statement in support of Biafra. Maurice Robert, head of Service de Documentation Extérieure et de Contre-Espionnage, SDSCE, the French Foreign Intelligence Service. African Operations wrote in 2004 that his agency supplied the press with details about the war and told them to use the word genocide in their reporting. France declared Biafra Week on 17th of March 1969, centered on a 2-franc raffle held by the French Red Cross. Soon after, de Gaulle terminated arms shipments, then resigned on the 27th of April 1969. Interim President Alain Poher fired General Jacques Foccart, the lead coordinator of France's Africa policy. Georges Pompidou rehired Foccart and resumed support for Biafra, including cooperation with the South African Secret Service to import more weapons. Soviet Union. The Soviet Union strongly backed the Nigerian government, emphasizing the similarity with the Congo situation. Nigeria's need for more aircraft, which the United Kingdom and the United States refused to sell, led Gowon to accept a Soviet offer in the summer of 1967 to sell a squadron of 17 MiG-17 fighters. The British-trained Nigerian military tended to be distrustful of the Soviet Union, but the Soviet ambassador in Lagos, Alexander Romanov, a gregarious and friendly man as well as a shrewd diplomat, established an excellent rapport with Gowon and persuaded him that accepting Soviet weapons would not mean subjection to the Soviet Union. The first MiG-17S arrived in Nigeria in August 1967 together with some 200 Soviet technicians to train the Nigerians in their use. Though the MiG-17S turned out to be too sophisticated for the Nigerians to use properly, requiring Egyptian Air Force pilots to fly them, the Soviet-Nigeria arms deal turned out to be one of the turning points of the war. Besides establishing an arms pipeline from the Soviet Union to Nigeria, the possibility that the Soviet Union would gain greater influence in Nigeria led the United Kingdom to increase its supply of arms to maintain its influence in Lagos, while ruling out the possibility of either the United States or Britain recognizing Biafra. The Soviet Union constantly supplied Nigeria with weapons, with the diplomatic disclaimer that these were strictly for cash on a commercial basis. In 1968, the USSR agreed to finance the Kainji Dam on the Niger, somewhat upriver from the delta. Soviet media outlets initially accused the British of cynically supporting the Biafran secession, then had to adjust these claims later when it turned out that the United Kingdom was, in fact, supporting the federal government. One explanation for Soviet sympathy with the federal military government was a shared opposition to internal secessionist movements. Before the war, the Soviets had seemed sympathetic to the Igbos. But Soviet Prime Minister Alexei Kosygin stated to their chagrin in October 1967 that the Soviet people fully understand Nigeria's motives and its need to prevent the country from being dismembered. Reportedly, the war substantially improved Soviet-Nigerian diplomatic and trade relations, and Moskvich cars began to make appearances around Lagos. The USSR became a competitive importer of Nigerian cacao. China. Because the Soviet Union was one of Nigeria's leading supporters, supplying arms on a generous scale, China, having recently become rivals with the Soviets in the Sino-Soviet split, declared its support for Biafra. In its first major statement on the war in September 1968, the Xinhua press agency stated the People's Republic of China fully supported the justified struggle for liberation of the people of Biafra against the Nigerian government, supported by Anglo-American imperialism and Soviet revisionism. China supported arms to Biafra via Tanzania, supplying arms worth some $2 million in 1968-1969. Israel. From early on, Israel perceived that Nigeria would be an important player in West African politics and saw good relations with Lagos as an important foreign policy objective. Nigeria and Israel established a linkage in 1957. In 1960, the United Kingdom allowed the creation of an Israeli diplomatic mission in Lagos, and Israel made a $10 million loan to the Nigerian government. Israel also developed a cultural relation with the Igbos based on possible shared traditions. These moves represented a significant diplomatic success given the Muslim orientation of the northern-dominated government. Some northern leaders disapproved of contact with Israel and banned Israelis from Maiduguri and Sokoto. Israel did not begin arms sales to Nigeria until after Aguiyi Ironsi came to power on the 17th of January 1966. This was considered an opportune time to develop this relationship with the federal government. Ram Nirgad became Israeli ambassador to Nigeria in January. 30 tons of mortar rounds were delivered in April. The eastern region began seeking assistance from Israel in September 1966. Israel apparently turned down their requests repeatedly, although they may have put the Biafran representatives in contact with another arms dealer. In 1968, Israel began supplying the federal military government with arms, about $500,000 worth, according to the U.S. State Department. Meanwhile, as elsewhere, the situation in Biafra became publicized as a genocide. The Knesset publicly debated this issue on 17 and the 22nd of July 1968, winning applause from the press for its sensitivity. Right-wing and left-wing political groups and student activists spoke for Biafra. In August 1968, the Israeli Air Force overtly sent 12 tons of food aid to a nearby site outside of Nigerian, Biafran, airspace. Covertly, Mossad provided Biafra with $100,000 through Zurich and attempted an arms shipment. Soon after, Israel arranged to make clandestine weapons shipments to Biafra using Ivory Coast transport planes. The nations of both Sub-Saharan Africa tended to support the Arabs in the Israeli-Palestinian dispute by voting for resolutions sponsored by Arab states at the United Nations. A major goal of Israeli diplomacy was to wean the African states away from the Arab states, and given the way that the majority of African nations supported Nigeria, Israel was loath to antagonize them by supporting Biafra too overtly. Egypt. President Gamal Abdel Nasser dispatched pilots of the Egyptian Air Force to fight for Nigeria in August 1967, flying the recently arrived MiG-17S. The tendency of Egyptian pilots to indiscriminately bomb Biafran civilians proved counterproductive in the propaganda war, as the Biafrans did their best to publicize cases of civilians killed by the Egyptians. In the spring of 1969, the Nigerians replaced the Egyptian pilots with European pilots who proved to be considerably more competent. United States.